All right, so before we get started, can we make sure everybody has their phones set to off? So they don't go off, I'll do the same. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. I want to welcome you to our On the Issues program, focusing on the Marquette Law School poll, specifically focusing on the state of Wisconsin. I want to thank many of you who probably, like me, slept in our car last night to get here from last night's debate watch party till today. So thank you for coming 2 days in a row. I really appreciate that. Once again, I'm joined by the director of the Marquette Law Poll, Dr. Charles Franklin. Charles, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, that's what you do now, but how do you feel after the presentation?
So I'm going to just go over our itinerary for today. We're going to start off with the methodology. It's important that everybody knows how we got here and what the processes were. We're going to talk about the presidential matchup. We just coming fresh off the debate last night. And even though this poll here will not focus anything after the debate, it's important to talk about things that happened post conventions. We're going to talk about the Senate race between Tammy Baldwin and Eric Hovde. And the part that I enjoy the most, Charles, is the issues, where the candidates stand on issues and how the public feels the candidates stand on issues. And finally, we're going to talk about enthusiasm and the lack thereof, if that's the case. Charles, I'm going to ask you to start us off with the methodology because I think it's important that people know how we got here.
Yep. So generally, this is similar to what you've seen 80 times before. We were in the field August 28th to September 5th. If you're keeping track, that was beginning the Wednesday after the Democratic convention. The previous poll had started the Wednesday after the Republican convention, so our schedule is aligned there. We talked to 822 registered voters. That has a margin of error of plus or minus 4.6 percentage points. And there are 438 likely voters with a slightly higher margin of error of 4.7 percentage points. And because I know you're a geeky crowd and want to know this, I talked to you last time about comparing our traditional measure of likely voters as people who say they're absolutely certain to vote. Now that we're sampling from the voter list, we know people's turnout in previous elections since 2016. We don't know how they voted, just whether they voted or not. We've shifted to a likely voter model that uses that information, which is arguably a bit more reliable than people's self-report of turnout. In practice, we've seen very little difference between using our traditional measure and using this likely voter model. I think the results last time were off by tenths of a point. We're different from one another by tenths of a point. This time they're 1 point or less difference, so still a very small difference. So why shift? The main reason is I think the modeled probability of voting is probably a little bit more stable over the course of the campaign, gives us more comparable results from poll to poll. But just wanted to let you know that we've made that small change without much real impact. Partisan makeup?
Please.
So this sample is 35% Republican, 32% Democratic, 32 independent. That's a bit less independent than normal. Our long-term balance has been 30 Republican, 29 Dem, and 40 independent. So we're 8 points less independent in this sample, with both partisan groups going up. Instead of a 1 point Republican advantage, we have a 3 point Republican advantage. But as a whole, the people that answered our survey see themselves in more partisan terms than they did last time or they normally do. I don't know if this is a fluke of one sample or whether it reflects greater engagement in the campaign, which is plausible. In national polling, you usually see the percentage independents decline during an election year and running up to election day, though we haven't seen that much in our polling. So just want you to be alert to that. We're a little bit more Republican than usual, and 8 points is actually quite a bit less independent. Whoops, sorry, I got sidetracked here. So that's just what I was saying to you. Okay?
So how far are we out?
54 days.
All right.
That number keeps getting lower and lower. Kind of hard to believe. 54 days to go. And so 4-point race. Harris at 52, Trump at 48. That's with registered voters. Now, don't blink when I go to the next slide, which is also 52-48 with likely voters. So it just makes no difference between registered and likely. In a very high turnout state like ours, it's often the case those are pretty similar, but just no difference in this particular sample. Remember, in the last poll, with registered voters, it was Trump 50, Harris 49. And with likely voters, it was Harris 50, Trump 49. So just a tiny little bit of a difference between registered and likely this time, but clearly an improvement for Harris across the 3 or so different ways, really 4 different ways we asked the vote question. Last time, it was Trump by 1, Harris by 1, or Harris by 2. This time, it's 4, 4, 4, and 5 across the different ways you can ask the question, whether you included third parties or not. So a very consistent result. This is a shade higher than the 3-point average Harris lead in the polling averages of Wisconsin as of this morning. So we're just a smallest shade above that average.
So my question for you, though, this poll was taking post-convention. So is this normal for a post-convention bump like this percentage amount?
It's hard to say is the easy answer. We normally see in the post-convention poll the biggest lead for that candidate after the last convention. That's usually the best poll for the candidate that held the last convention. So this would certainly be consistent with a post-convention bounce for her. We haven't seen much evidence of a post-convention bounce in other polling and national polling. So maybe we're catching a bounce that others haven't caught. Maybe it's happening here, but not nationally. And let's be clear about this. When we're talking about going to 52-48 from 50-49, we're just talking about a couple of points up for one and down by 1 for the other. So remember that margin of error, plus or minus 4.6 points. These changes are all inside that margin of error. But having said all of that, other things that you'll see as we go look like Harris is in a little bit better shape this time than last time. And that's true despite it being a slightly more Republican sample than it was last time.
So this is the head-to-head matchup, but what about when you add the other candidates, third-party candidates?
So in that multi-candidate race, 4 points, yet again, among registered voters. Kennedy is now at 6%, and the other third-party candidates are either getting 1 or 0%. That would, if we just add that up, a 9% total third-party vote is still a good bit bigger than what we normally see. The biggest total third-party vote recently was in 2016 when it was 5.5% total for all the third-party candidates. In 2020, it was only 1.5%. So we'll see if this still stays above that 5.5 and certainly looks likely to stay above the 1.5 we saw last time. But as you'll see,
now, but the Kennedy vote keeps getting less, but he's out of the race.
Yeah, yes. And so 2 things. First, I wasn't sure if people knew he'd gotten out of the race, and overwhelmingly people all knew that. 86% knew that. So it's not a question of people being misinformed that he's still in the race. and voting for him because they think he's still in the race. It certainly looks like the vast majority of people who are still saying they're voting for him are doing that despite knowing that he paused or suspended his campaign.
How about trends?
Trends, love trends. Here, the main thing is that mustard-colored line that's declining. That's Kennedy. And he's going from 16% to 13% to 8% to 8%, and now to 6%. So the decline is quite clear and pretty substantial since last spring. The others actually have also come down a little bit. None of the others were ever very high, but you can see that back in February, they were getting 2 or 3%, even 4%, and are all down now at 1 or 0%. So that measure of third-party enthusiasm or support has fallen off, not just Kennedy's. And you can also see here in the multi-candidate race that Trump had a tiny lead over Biden through the 3 spring polls, but Harris has led by a little bit. That was the 2-point lead last time in this multi-candidate race. That's now a 4-point lead.
I'm interested in this next slide because it's a little different than before last month.
Yes. Who's likely to win? Now, we're talking here about win the presidency, not talking about win in Wisconsin. And in this poll, 48% say Harris is likely to win. That is definitely or probably likely to win. 41% say Trump will win, and 11% say they don't know. Last time, Harris was down in the high 30s and Trump was in the low 50s, with, again, about 11% who said they didn't know. Hint, the 11% is the right answer. Don't know who's going to win. But we do see a real shift here. Remember also for timing that previous poll was the week after the RNC. It was after Harris had gotten in the race and Biden had dropped out, but it was before the Democratic convention. So now we're comparing post-convention and obviously pre-debate.
Now, last month you had a comparison with how each party felt about their vice president candidate. Did you do the same for Tim Walz?
We did indeed, and in the same way. Among Democratic voters, he's quite popular. 59% say it was an excellent choice and 31% a good choice. So that gets us up to 90% of Democrats who are arguably pleased with his selection. We asked exactly the same question and presented it last time for J.D. Vance. He was at 75% high approval or support among Republicans, so not quite as high as Walz is with Democrats, but in both cases, a very solid majority of the party pleased or approving of that candidate, that vice presidential pick.
Now, before we move on to the Senate race real quick.
Yes.
Does anybody have any questions about what we've just discussed here in regards to the matchup?
Kennedy is totally off the ballot, isn't he?
No, he remains on the ballot in Wisconsin.
And for those who didn't hear, the question was whether or not Kennedy was completely off the ballot.
Yeah, Wisconsin law means that once you've filed your petition papers and they're approved, you can't get off the ballot unless you die. Not many people choose that option. Okay?
At least not by choice.
Yeah. Derek, do we have
Wait
time
for
for
the mic
one?
just
We're going
a
to bring
second.
the mic over.
I'll let you control the mic.
Both your polls were right after the conventions. How much bump do you really attribute? In other words, if we let a month go by,
Yeah.
what do you attribute to the bump?
Yeah, well, I think convention bounces, as I was saying, are usually the biggest after the second convention. There's a little bit of a rise here, so possibly that's a convention bounce on Harris's behalf. In Trump's case, you had the convention and, of course, the assassination attempt, but then that immediately got stepped on by Biden's withdrawing and Harris entering the race. So I think that probably suppressed some of the bounce that Trump might have gotten. The convention for Trump did raise Republican enthusiasm by about 7 percentage points, and his favorability ticked up just a little bit. So there was some evidence that the convention helped him, but I think he ran into a competing buzzsaw of news in the Biden-Harris switch that overshadowed the convention in the end. We're going in the field next Wednesday with a post-debate poll, so stay tuned there. There we should get a better idea of whether any convention bounce has dissipated. But of course, it'll also be whatever the effect of the debate may happen to be. So you never get a completely clean answer about what forces drive changes because so many things happen between races.
We're going to do one more question here and we'll come back.
Have you ever, is it on?
Yep.
Have you ever seen a relationship between the percentage who think a candidate is likely to win versus the support the candidate gets?
That's a real mixed picture. The question is, do you see a relationship between thinking somebody's going to win and supporting them, or vice versa? One thing you clearly see is that supporters of a candidate like to believe their person's going to win. And so that's a real strong effect. Democrats, on average, are going to be much more likely to say Harris will win. Republicans much more likely, on average, to say Trump will win. But you've got a similar mix of those kinds of people here, and there's been this shift in the anticipation. Now, I don't know if these people are in betting markets or not, so whether they'll put their money where their mouth is. But it does seem to have been a noticeable shift in that opinion.
Okay. We're going to move on to the Senate race real quick, and I'll come back to your question. You sure? Okay.
I'll get you on the next one.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about Baldwin and Hovde if we can.
Yes, let's do. So in the Senate race, we've got, this is going to get familiar, a 4-point race. 52-48 for Baldwin. Her number has fluctuated between as low as 4 and as high as 7 in our recent polling, so this is more or less in line with that. It was about a 5-point difference last time. That's with registered voters. With likely voters, it's a 5-point difference, a very slight difference between registered and likely. And if we look at the unleaned vote, as we call it, the first question is, would you vote for Baldwin or Hovde, or haven't you decided? And then the one I just showed you includes the, if you had to make a choice, had to decide who would you vote for. So this is useful. It's still a 4-point race, but it does show you that about 8% say they haven't made up their mind who they'll vote for. That number was up in the high teens a couple of months ago. It was down to about, I think, 12 or 14, and now it's down to 8. And so we are seeing people begin to focus on the Senate race a bit. We'll say more about the Senate race in detail in a little bit, but I think voters are beginning to pay attention to it in a way that over the summer, with all the happenings at the presidential level, perhaps they weren't paying as much attention.
So my question has to do with that 4-point difference. I think that the 4-point difference is, even though the president race and the Senate race are both 4 points, they're a different group of voters, though, aren't they?
A little bit. Sorry, this is the likely voters that is the 5-point difference. It's not exactly the same set of people that are voting for Harris and Baldwin or Trump and Hovde, though partisanship being what it is, there's not much crossover voting. We're seeing a little bit of crossover that favors Baldwin, but it only favors her by a couple of points, a couple of 3 percentage points. And so we're seeing an awful lot of party line voting. On the other hand, a month ago, she was leading by 5 or so, and the presidential race, at most, Harris had a 1 or 2 point lead. So this has been a little bit of a shift, but all of this is small amounts of shift that's taking place.
Let's add the other Senate candidates.
Then we do have 2 other independent candidates on the ballot, Anderson and Leaguer. Each of them are taking 2% of the vote. And in this one, Baldwin's lead bumps up just ever so slightly to a 6-point lead. I think one of the issues here for Republicans in the presidential race as well is that people who are very dissatisfied with American politics are drawn to Trump and other Republican candidates now. But because they're dissatisfied, they're also drawn to third-party candidates, protest vote candidates. There are certainly some progressives who are drawn to Jill Stein, for example, or Cornel West as progressive alternatives to Harris. But I think the effect is bigger on the Republican side. Now, having said that, let's not exaggerate how big this effect is. The margin is, you want to say it's 5 points or it's 6 points, hardly a difference there. But I think, and these two independents will see what vote they actually get on Election Day. But I think that dissatisfaction with politics, with government, and with major parties is one of the reasons that third-party candidates are doing a little better than they normally do.
Now, you asked a new question for this year. You've asked it back in 2013, but you brought it back in 2024. Could we talk about that a little bit?
I wonder what that question was. It was this. Which comes closer to your view about political divisions in Washington these days? Growing political divisions among elected officials reflect a more divided American society, or growing political divisions are mostly among elected officials and not American society in general. So we asked this in the fall of 2013. Seemed good to revisit it 11 years later. Okay, what do you think happened? So the green line is divided society. The tan line is government officials. So back in 13, it was 53% said it was elected officials who were divided, 38 said it's society. But now 65% say the divisions are largely due to divisions in society, rather than the 34% who now attribute it primarily to elected officials. So I think that's a rather striking shift in how we view the challenges in our society. It's not like 2010, 2012, 2013 weren't pretty hard-fought, divisive times. But the way people looked at those divisions put a little more blame on elite leaders, elected officials. But now we seem to see our society itself is more divided, by a fair margin, too.
Now we're coming to my favorite part of the poll, which has to do with the images of the candidates and national issues. So can we start with the images of the candidates?
Sure. I am so tempted to put up a picture and say, you wanted an image, here it is. Okay, so for longtime readers, this is a new chart, so let's explain it a little bit. Over on the left, you can see these phrases that we've been asking about all year. Is this candidate too old to be president? Have they behaved corruptly? Do they have a strong record of accomplishments? And so on. So the red dot is how people see Donald Trump, and the blue dot is how they see Kamala Harris. And so on the first one, too old to be president, you can see it's about 59% say Trump is too old, that describes him either very well or somewhat well. And about 14% say that about Harris. She's aging rapidly because that was 12% last time. Little change. And then the next one, behaved corruptly. You see Trump is up about 62 or 3%. Harris is at about 38 or so. These are also arranged in order. So the biggest gap with Trump more is at the top. The biggest gap with Harris more is at the bottom. So as we go down these, on strong record of accomplishments, Trump still holds an advantage there. He held an advantage over Biden as well. It's a little bit smaller with Harris than it was with Biden, but it's still Trump's advantage. Is a strong leader. Their two are very close. Trump slightly more seen as a strong leader, but Harris close. Harris was at 50% on that last month, so she's ticked up 2 or maybe 3 points in the meantime. Then we go to shares your values, where Harris has the first, I'm sorry, I skipped intelligent, is intelligent. Some of us aren't. Harris has a small lead on this. We've not asked it before, but since Trump has criticized her as not smart, as low IQ and other kinds of phrases that he uses, I thought it was good to see whether the public sees her that way. And it's not the case that they do, at least in this poll this time. A small advantage, though in absolute terms, Trump is over 50% on that measure too. Then shares your values. Here, Harris has a small lead where Biden and Trump were fairly close to being tied on this issue, on this perception before. So she's a little better off there. Has the communication skills to be president. She's advantaged there. We asked that last time. It's fairly similar to last time. Then is honest, and you can see the gap rises just a little bit. And finally, has the right temperament, where she has a significant advantage. That was one that Biden also had the advantage on temperament. Looking over the ones that we asked for both Biden and Trump, Biden had the advantage on 2, Trump had the advantage on 2, and one of them was tied. Here you see that the advantage has shifted in Harris's direction, and even on the ones that we asked both times, she's doing a little bit better than Biden was doing. And on the age issue and on corruption, she's significantly better off than Biden was, especially on age, where 76% saw Biden as too old. So that's a huge change.
What's interesting to me about this chart, though, is to me at least, if you ask someone, what makes a strong leader, I just have this opinion that people would say, well, you got to be intelligent, you got to be honest, you got to be, and despite the fact that she leads in those categories, former President Trump is still viewed as being the stronger leader.
Good point. And a lot of these things overlap. You will hardly be surprised that people tend to see positive attributes of their favored candidate. They see negative attributes of the other opposed candidate. So these are not fully independent measures, but they're chosen because they're things that are being talked about. The age issue obviously was talked about for a long time. Corruption was talked about for a long time. Now the campaigns have brought up questions of honesty and temperament and intelligence. And so that's why I'm putting those particular items on here.
I have to say, I speak just for myself, I hope people agree with me, I really prefer this form of chart than the previous form. For me, it's easier for me to see the balance.
So you didn't like it
I didn't like
before,
it. I'm sorry.
Huh? All right, well, we'll see what the audience votes. But I like these better too. Also, I should say, for whoever it was that wrote and complained about the small size of the slides last time,
thank you.
I hope you won't complain about these, because I can't make them
I
any bigger than this.
I appreciate that person who did that. Thank you.
Yeah. See, we do respond to beatings occasionally.
So can we talk about the issues?
Yes, we can talk about the issues. So on the national issues, similar chart, slightly different explanation. This is the question of who would do better, which candidate would better handle at the top immigration and border security. And the red dot, again, is Trump, and the blue dot is Harris, so you can see that Trump has a substantial advantage on handling that issue. The tan dot at the bottom is the percent who say they don't see any difference between these two candidates on immigration. They could have said they'd both be good, or there'd be no difference between them, or they could have said they'd both be bad on the issue. I'm lumping those two together. No difference between them. And so you can see that about 13% say there's no difference between Harris and Trump on the border. Then the Israel-Hamas war, Trump has the second largest advantage, a bit smaller than on the border. And then on the economy, that's the third largest Trump advantage. And again, you can see on the economy in particular that the no difference between them is under 10% this month, going down a bit. Foreign relations, Trump has a slim advantage on that, which he's had over Biden during the spring as well. But then we switch to the issues that Harris is leading on: Medicare and Social Security, then health care, then ensuring fair elections, and finally abortion policy. So this order hasn't changed much, whereas the character or personality traits did change a good bit with the switch from Biden to Harris. This set of issues has remained the same, with Trump doing best on the border, the war, and the economy, a close division on foreign relations with an edge to Trump. But then, whether it was Biden or Harris, leading on the other 4 issues. Harris's lead on the 4 that she's leading on are a bit bigger than they were under Biden, and she's narrowed Trump's advantages on the ones Trump is ahead on, but not by a whole lot. So there's been a lot of stability. Last thing is, I'm fascinated by the no difference between them. If you look here, about 12 or 13% say there's no difference between them on abortion policy. That may seem puzzling, though somebody might say neither of them have good policies on that and might have a reason to believe that. But I have been watching this all year because I've wanted to see whether the campaign showed up what those differences were and amplified them. With Biden in the race, we were running 20 to 25% not seeing a difference between the candidates. And now that's down to this roughly 8 to 15% not seeing a difference. Hard to know whether that's because of Kamala Harris and the kind of race she's running, or whether it's because we're deeper into the election cycle and so people are tuning in to the election, which I think is possible. And of course, the debate last night is another chance for people to see differences they may not have. So we'll watch this one up to Election Day and see if it changes further.
Any questions on images or issues? We'll get the mic. Up here front.
Do you rate the importance of issues among voters? In other words,
yes,
what
and that's
issues
coming
are
up in a slide or two of how much importance they assign to the issues. Okay? Okay.
All right. You're going to have to explain, because this is relatively new.
Brand new, in
right.
fact. So I guess I should explain it
Please.
before I subject you to looking at it, and then we'll explain it again. We have always asked people, how would you describe yourself politically? Would you say your political views are very conservative, moderate, somewhat liberal, very liberal? This time, we're asking for people to say whether they see Kamala Harris as very conservative, moderate, somewhat liberal, very liberal. We ask the same question of Trump, of both vice presidents, and of the Senate candidates, Baldwin and Hovde. And we also continue to ask them how they see themselves. So with that background, here's what the chart shows. On the left is Harris. And again, that scale goes from very conservative to very liberal. So if you look at the right side of the blue bars, you're looking at the percent saying Harris is very liberal. I think that's 52%, say that describes her. If you look right next to her, the tall red bar, that's the percent saying Trump is very conservative. I think Harris is 52 and Trump is 53 on very liberal and very conservative. So with the discussion that we've heard about extreme candidates, ideologically extreme candidates, both of these candidates look essentially the same in terms of just over half saying they're in the either most liberal category or the most conservative category. There are small differences in the somewhat categories. Slightly more see Trump as somewhat conservative than see Harris as somewhat liberal. And finally, if you look at the middle bar, the moderate bar, it's a little bit more that see Harris as moderate than see Trump as moderate. She's up in the upper teens, and he's at about 10%. So not a huge difference here. Obviously, both of them are seen as very different in terms of ideology, that she is clearly a liberal of some level of degree. He's clearly a conservative of some level of degree. But at least in the voters' perceptions, not right now, there's not a wildly different perception of her as much more liberal than those who see him as much more conservative.
Charles, I really want to meet the people who think that Harris is very conservative and Trump is very liberal.
Yes,
I want to meet those people.
I'm happy they answered my survey. That's all I'll say. In all fairness, lots of political science research shows that while liberal and conservative may be common terms for people who came to this talk, they're not necessarily very well known throughout the society. And so there are people that really aren't familiar with the terms. And that's one answer to it. I did want to point out the people on the right, because that's us. That's all respondents and how they describe themselves. And I just think this is not an uncommon finding. This is, in fact, something we've seen for decades, that the public as a whole at least sees themselves as relatively moderate, maybe leaning a little bit left or a little bit right, and relatively small percentages put themselves in the very conservative or the very liberal category, unlike the way you can see that they see the candidates. But regardless of where you are on this self-description, you still are choosing between a pair of candidates that are clearly seen as considerably further to the left or considerably further to the right than the public sees itself. Okay?
Yeah. Any questions about?
I'm curious to know, in looking at the self-description today versus in 2013, if you had done something similar, and the differences in where the society is versus...
Right. We haven't generally measured the candidates on this scale, and so I don't have a wealth of background to go back to. There's national polling by others that have asked it, and on our national surveys, we ask it routinely, but we haven't generally asked it in Wisconsin, so I don't have the comparison. We do have the comparison about yourself over time, and that's been really quite stable. A bit more conservative or very conservative than liberal or very liberal. A big category in the middle of moderates. There's been a little bit of an increase in liberals going from about 21 or 22 up to around 26 or 27 over the last few years. But it's that kind of modest shift, not a wholesale shift.
When you were in the field, the 822 people, how'd you do that? Phone, email, text?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to get too bogged down in the methodology right now. I'd like to get through the substance of the presentation. I'm happy to talk about it, and we've talked about it frequently. We sample from the registered voter list. We send an email and a text message inviting the sample to conduct the poll online on their phone or tablet or whatever. And if we don't hear back from people, we phone them. About 20% are completed on phone, about 80% are completed online. But the main core of it is sampling from the registered voter list.
All right.
Otherwise, I've got an hour-and-a-half lecture on this topic, which I gave over at UWM the other day. So, so you see what I'm sparing you from having to endure. Okay, that's good.
Can we move on to Vance and Walz?
Yeah.
Same categories.
Yeah. Oops. I have got to get new glasses. So Walz is the blue one on the left and Vance on the right. Here you do see a difference. The very liberal side for Walz is, again, his highest category. But Vance is much higher in that very conservative category. Vance is at 61, whereas Trump was at 52. So Vance is seen as even further more conservative than Trump is. But Walz in the mid-40s is about 7 points, 8 points less than Harris is. And if you look at that moderate bar, for Walz it's about 20%, while for Vance it's just under 10%. So whatever Walz's record as governor was, which has been a point of attack for Republicans against him, the public, at least so far, at least here in Wisconsin, is not seeing him as extremist, and certainly is not seeing him even as liberal as they see Harris being. Whereas for Vance, they see him as more conservative than they see Trump. So a big difference there. People on the right, the people, haven't changed. They haven't changed their mind between the previous slide and now.
Before we go into the next slide, so last night we had a debate watch party here, and Senator, Republican Senator Julian Bradley, my first question to the panel was, what are the most important things for your constituency and for Republicans in Wisconsin? And he said, economy, 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 and immigration. That's what he's, and so this next slide actually counters a little bit of that.
Little bit in some ways, and in other ways not.
Yep.
The economy is absolutely right. By far the most important problem. This is after whoever asked about issues. After we went through those issues about who's better on those, we asked a couple of other questions, and then we go back to them and say, now, which of those issues is most important for your vote this November? And the economy has been at the top of the list all year long. If anything, it may have grown a little bit this time over where it was last time. Then you drop well down to abortion policy in second place and immigration in third place. Last month, abortion had moved into second place, but it was just 1 point ahead of immigration. Immigration has dipped, not much, but another 3 points or so below abortion policy. And then we get to Medicare and Social Security, under 10 points, but a fairly consistent fourth place over the polling period. And then ensuring fair and accurate elections, just about the same. Then a real drop-off for healthcare, foreign relations, and finally the war between Israel and Hamas. So this has been pretty consistent, though abortion has climbed from being in third place to being in second place. Immigration has been declining for the last 6 months or so, not precipitously, but it has been coming down a bit. So appropriate that Senator Bradley would go through 3 economies and 1 immigration. But it's more important to look at it by party to understand why he would say that. Here's that same thing, but the most important by party. So again, the red dots are Republicans, the gray dot is independents, the blue dot is Democrats. And the economy with that red dot is way out there to the right, soaring above any other issue. Indeed, if you look at the red dot for immigration, it's more than halfway down compared to the red dot for the economy. So even among Republicans, immigration is clearly the number 2 issue, but it's well below the economy. And then you'll search for a red dot that's over 10%. For Republicans all year long, but especially this time, it is the economy, then immigration, and then almost nothing else rises to significant salience. For Democrats, it's abortion number 1 by just a little bit, with the economy second, and then you get to Medicare as third place and fair elections as fourth place for Democrats. I want to look at independents for a second, because if you look at the economy, independents, the gray dot, is putting the economy way up there, over 40% saying that's the most important for them. But look at what happens with abortion. While Democrats put abortion way up, independents put it way down, almost as low as Republicans put the issue. And then the flip of that is with immigration, where Republicans do think immigration is pretty important. But independents are down closer to Democrats on low importance of that rather than closer to Republicans. So if you think of campaign strategy, Democrats have a base that is extraordinarily energized over abortion. But independents, even though 2/3 of independents favor abortion rights, just don't rate it as a very important issue. And conversely, Republicans and the former president talk an awful lot about immigration as an issue, but independents are not dismissing the issue, but they're not nearly as involved with it as the party base is. So this is a challenge for the campaigns. And then finally, the last one is the oldie but goodie Medicare and Social Security, which has been around as an issue for as long as I can remember. But independents rank that surprisingly high, close to where Democrats rank it. Republicans way down on that issue. So it's sort of a sleeper issue because it's such old hat to argue about it, but it is striking that it maintains a substantial concern among independents. And skip the others.
Well, real
Okay.
quick, I was surprised with the whole Stop the Steal movement that ensuring the accurate elections was so low in the state amongst Republicans.
I think there's a complication here. Saving democracy has become a core Democratic talking point. We didn't phrase it that way here because I try not to repeat the slogans of either party. So ensuring fair and accurate elections, I thought, was one that might evoke those Republicans who are still very upset or concerned about 2020 and recent elections. But you can see it largely appeals to Democrats, not much to independents, and even a little less for Republicans. We haven't asked it in this survey or the last couple, but we've asked frequently about whether you thought the 2020 election was the vote was accurately cast and counted. 2/3 say it was, 1/3 say it was not. But among Republicans, that's exactly reversed. 2/3 of Republicans say it was not accurate, 1/3 think it was. But those numbers haven't changed since we started asking this question in 2021. And so there's been very little evidence of a changing opinion about the 2020 outcome. But how the rhetoric frames fair and accurate elections, I think on the basis of this, maybe that is still a little bit more of a Democratic talking point. And if we'd asked about whether you thought the 2020 election was stolen, we would have gotten certainly a reversal of this.
So are we enthused? Are we not entertained?
We are totally entertained, baby. Yeah, you'll know the answer if I change the exclamation mark to a question mark next time, right? So here's what's happened. There's been this big rally in enthusiasm. The green line is this year. The light purple line was in 2020 at the same period of the campaign. And you can see that between June and July, we caught up to where we'd been in 2020. We'd been running between 15 and 20 points below the 2020 levels of enthusiasm. We caught up last time. We've stayed caught up this time, smidgen more in 2020, but just a smidgen. And the biggest thing is what happened by party. Enthusiasm among Republicans was running well ahead of enthusiasm among Democrats as long as Biden was in the race. Then in last month's poll, Republicans still had just a tiny edge on it, but just a tiny one. And now this month, Democrats have surged ahead, clearly leading in enthusiasm. Independents are having a hard time getting excited about this race. It's not unusual for independents to be less engaged because they're not partisan. They don't follow politics as closely as partisans do. But we did see enthusiasm for independents tick up in July, but this time it's ticked back down. So stay tuned. It's not at all clear whether independents will get excited between now and November. And what was it, 54 days?
55 days.
55 days. The other thing that's changed is who's ahead by enthusiasm, and these are those slides you don't like, but maybe I'll fix them next time. Of the very enthusiastic to vote, Harris now leads by about 6 points, and also among those somewhat enthusiastic, and a smaller advantage among the not too enthusiastic. But Trump has a large advantage on the not at all enthusiastic. This is the reverse of where it was with Biden. With Biden as the candidate, Trump had a big lead with the very enthusiastic, but Biden led with the other three categories of not enthusiastic, including a big lead with the not at all enthusiastic. And so this is one of the giant changes that's taken place. But a good chunk of that, of course, is because because Democrats who used to be not enthusiastic now are enthusiastic. And Republicans haven't, let's back up one. Republicans haven't really gone down. In fact, you can see their enthusiasm went up in July. That was the convention bounce I was talking about earlier. And it's basically the same. It dipped by a point or so this time, but basically stayed energized from the convention. But the Democrats got that enthusiasm before their convention and have added to it now in the time since. Okay?
Favorability?
Favorability.
Who do we like?
Oh, we like them all. Not. That's getting to be a punchline. But can you spot the one who has a positive favorability? Tim Walz. The tan boxes, which I'm sorry, the numbers are a little messed up. Harris is a net -4, meaning 4 points more unfavorable than favorable. Trump a net -13. But Walz a +6 and Vance a -10. Let's just stop there for a second. And so I've been used to seeing these being negative for everybody every time. So it is kind of interesting that Walz stands out as the one exception. Now, he's still not well known. 19% now, after the convention, say they don't know enough about him to have an opinion. But it is 16% that don't have an opinion of J.D. Vance either. So both VPs are much less well known than their presidential candidates are. But I think if you just want to rate successful rollout, you would say, well, it looks like Walz does have this successful rollout, whether it will continue. And I believe the VP debate is October 1st, I want to say it is. So we will see him on a center stage with Vance before too long. Then you go to the others. Joe Biden is still substantially negative, worse than Trump. Kennedy, -8 is actually a little better than he was last time. And Stein, West, and Oliver are all negative, but the key thing with them are the gray bars. 62% don't know, 70% don't know, and 90% don't know. So those third-party candidates are really very little known.
Do you attribute Kennedy throwing his support behind Trump helping his favorability number?
Yeah, I don't know is the real answer to that. It's not something that we asked about in terms of we asked about whether you knew he dropped out. We didn't ask about whether you knew he had endorsed Trump. It may be that Republicans were reticent to be favorable to Kennedy when they saw him as a competitor to Trump, but now that he's dropped out and endorsed, that may be what's going on. But I didn't ask the question necessary to check into that.
All right. How about the combined favorability among registered voters for Harris and Trump?
The key thing here is the one at the bottom, and no, you may not call me during this. See, it's not enough to just turn the phone off. You have to actually turn it completely off. This is the so-called double haters. That's the bottom category. KH, Kamala Harris, and DT, Donald Trump, unfavorable to both is at 8%. That's down from about 11% last month, and it's down from about 17% that were unfavorable to both Biden and to Trump. And so the double haters are now under 10%. This is getting down into the range that we actually saw in 2020 and that we saw in 2012, though in 2012 it was even lower than this. So there has been some movement there. The other is the relative comparison of the blue and red bar. The blue bar are people that like Harris and dislike Trump, and the red bar like Trump and dislike Harris. The red bar has been bigger with the comparison with Biden. In other words, more people like Trump and not Biden than liked Biden and not Trump. Not by much, but by a bit. And in last month's poll, slightly more like Trump and not Harris. Now that's reversed with Harris taking a small lead on this joint favorability, combined favorability of the two. And we may quit talking about double haters if that 8% keeps going down.
I was just going to ask, what are you going to do without the double haters?
Ah, man, it's love time, you know?
The almost lovers. Almost lovers.
Yes.
So what about Senate candidate favorability?
Yeah. So Baldwin is a net +1 this time, 47-46. 7% say they don't know enough about her. And Hovde's a net -9, 34-43. 22% don't know enough. We'll see a trend in a moment about how much people have come to know Hovde. In fact, why don't we just go ahead and do that? So this is Baldwin's trend, and you can see not a lot of movement in this. She's been a point or two more unfavorable than favorable, a point or two more favorable than unfavorable. This month, it's that 1 point net favorable. It was tied even, dead even, last month. There's been a slight decline in the gray line, the percent that don't know enough about her. So even though she's running for a third term in the Senate, we still started out with 15% saying they didn't know enough to have an opinion. And you can see that's now down to just a little over 5%. So people are getting to know her a little better. But this is her favorability by political party. And you can see that Democrats are waking up and coming home to her, generally rising, a slight dip last month, a slight increase this month. But independents, who bounce around a bit, have moved up over the last 3 polls, having peaked in February and then come down a little bit, are now coming up a little bit. And Republicans, who are not really fans, have slightly edged down. But again, all of this is consistent with the way campaigns bring home people to their parties, especially for candidates like Senate candidates who are less visible than presidential candidates where everybody has an opinion of them. Let's look at Hovde and his trend. And here the headline is really the gray line. That was up around over 80% didn't have an opinion of him back in February. And that's now down to 22%. So campaigns matter. He's introducing himself, and we're seeing fairly typical increases in awareness of him. Until this month, his unfavorables were rising faster than his favorables. So his net favorability had actually gotten a little bit worse over the spring and early summer. But this month, he's improved that a little bit. He's still net negative. But you can just see visually the green line moves up a little bit more than the purple line. Still net negative by that -9, but in better shape than he was, and considerably better known to the public.
Because we're running up on time, if you don't mind,
Yep.
Since this is a statewide poll, can we just look at the direction,
Sure.
direction of the state, maybe Governor Evers' approval rating, things of that nature?
Whoop, shoot. Help! I'm not quite sure how to make it go back to.
He's coming.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to the end unless you can quickly jump to the end. Just go to the very last one and I'll work my way back. Okay, so this is the right direction, wrong track question. Is the state generally headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track? Purple is wrong track, green is right direction, because we think green is happy and good. And what the main point here is you see that the people are still pretty pessimistic about the state. More people still say the wrong direction. But the gap between them has been narrowing across the year. And we are asking here specifically about the state. We're not asking about the country or anything like that. But it is improved a little bit from where it has been. On the other hand, views of the national economy have not changed very much. That's this. Green is excellent or good national economic conditions. Red is poor. And that sort of grayish line is not so good. It looked in the spring like the green line had gone up, the red line had gone down. It looked like maybe people were having a better view of the economy. But you can see that the red line, having dropped and stayed dropped, has moved up and up and is down just a shade this time. While the green line, having moved up, really hadn't moved up much more over time. And that gray line has bounced around a little bit without a pretty clear trend. If I told you that excellent and good is about a third, not so good is about a third, and poor is about a third, that would be basically right all year long, with fluctuations of a point or two on each of those numbers. So not a whole lot of real variation in this. Certainly no sign of morning again in America, as Ronald Reagan put it back in the 80s, but also no particular sign of impending doom and recession either. Still a very high percentage who say poor.
Charles, we're at time. If we could please give a round of applause to Dr. Franklin. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. A double thank you for those who spent the night here last night and came back again this morning. Join us next week. Next week, we started that Get to Know program when we bring in people that you didn't know. But I wanted to add a new element called the face of the case. There's a lot of cases that we talk about all the time in this building with our law students and lawyers. But I wanted to put a face to those names of those cases. And so next week, the historic landmark case of Obergefell versus Hodges, the case which legalized same-sex marriage, we have Jim Obergefell, the plaintiff in that case, will be here next week to talk about it. So hopefully we see you then. Please be safe. Please drive home safely, and thank you so much for coming.